Have you ever noticed how you start explaining yourself before anyone even asks a question, as if your existence needs to be justified in advance, as if every choice you make must come with a reason attached to it, something acceptable, something digestible for others? And somewhere along the way, this turns into a quiet habit, one that slowly drains you without you even realizing it. Because it is not just about words, it is about the feeling that you're not allowed to simply be, that who you are must always be explained, softened, translated, made easier for the world to accept. And that is exhausting in a way that sleep cannot fix, because it is not physical, it is something deeper, something that touches your sense of worth, your right to exist without apology. Maybe you have caught yourself doing it in small moments, explaining why you're tired, explaining why you said no, explaining why you needed space, as if choosing yourself required permission, as if caring for your own energy was something you had to defend. And the more you do it, the more it becomes automatic, until one day you realize you're not just explaining actions. You're explaining your emotions, your needs, even your silence. And without noticing it, you begin to live as if your existence is a question waiting to be answered, as if you owe the world a constant explanation for being who you are. And this does not come from nowhere. It has roots, deep ones, often buried in moments you barely remember, moments when you learned that being yourself was not always safe, that expressing something too honestly could lead to rejection, to misunderstanding, or to being told that what you feel is wrong, too much, inappropriate, and so you adapted. You learned to adjust, to soften your voice, to rehearse your words before speaking, to monitor yourself as if you were walking through a space where one wrong step could cost you connection. And over time, this turns into something internal, something that follows you even when no one is watching. Because now you're the one questioning yourself before anyone else does. This is how the mind tries to protect you, by anticipating rejection, by preparing explanations in advance, by turning your inner world into something that can be defended, something that can survive judgment. But the cost of that protection is high, because the more you explain, the further you move away from your natural state, the one where you simply feel, simply exist, without needing to justify it. And slowly, almost invisibly, your voice changes. It stops being an expression of who you are and becomes a tool of defense, something you use not to share yourself, but to protect yourself from being misunderstood. And here is something important to understand. Not everyone is trying to understand you, and no amount of explaining will change that, because understanding is not created by better words. It is created by willingness, by openness, by the ability of the other person to truly see you. And if that is not there, your explanations become something else entirely. They become a loop, a cycle where you keep trying to clarify, to refine, to say it better, hoping that this time it will land, that this time it will be received the way you intend. But often it does not. And that is not because you failed to explain. It is because the other person was never really listening in the first place. There is a moment, sometimes quiet, sometimes almost invisible, where something inside you begins to shift. A realization that explaining yourself over and over again is not bringing you closer to being understood. It is only pulling you further away from yourself. And that realization can feel uncomfortable at first, because it challenges something you have been doing for a long time, something that once helped you survive, but now no longer serves you. And in that moment, a different possibility begins to appear. The possibility that you do not need to explain everything, that your feelings do not require external validation to be real, that your choices do not need to be justified in order to be valid. This is where silence begins to take on a new meaning, not as something empty, not as something forced, but as something intentional, something chosen, a space where you no longer feel the need to translate yourself for others. And this kind of silence is very different from the silence that comes from fear, because silence born from fear is heavy. It feels like holding something back, like swallowing your truth to avoid conflict. But silence that comes from self-respect feels different. It feels grounded, steady, almost like a boundary that does not need to be announced. A quiet decision that says, I do not need to convince you of who I am. And this distinction matters because not all silence heals. Some silence hides. Some silence suppresses. Some silence is rooted in the fear of being seen. And that kind of silence can become suffocating over time. It can make you feel disconnected from yourself, as if your own voice is something distant, something you no longer fully recognize. But the silence that comes from choosing yourself is something else entirely. It is not about hiding. It is about returning. Returning to a place within you where you can hear yourself again without interference, without the constant need to adjust, to explain, to defend. There is something deeply restorative about that kind of silence, because for the first time in a long time, you are not speaking to be accepted. You are not shaping your words to fit expectations. You are simply allowing yourself to exist without commentary. And in that space, something begins to soften. The tension that comes from constant self-explanation starts to fade. The need for approval becomes less urgent. And gradually, you begin to feel a different kind of stability, one that does not depend on how others respond to you, but on how you relate to yourself. And this is where the deeper psychological layer begins to reveal itself. Because what we often call the need to explain is connected to something Jung described in a different way. The relationship between what we show and what we hide, between the persona and the shadow, the parts of ourselves we believe are acceptable, and the parts we have learned to suppress. And when you feel the need to constantly explain yourself, it is often because there is a part of you that fears being seen as unacceptable, a part that has been pushed into the background, into the shadow, waiting, watching, influencing how you speak, how you present yourself, how you navigate relationships. Because the more you try to appear a certain way, the more energy it takes to maintain that image. And explaining yourself becomes one of the ways you manage that image. You shape your narrative, you adjust your tone, you filter your truth, all in an effort to remain within what feels safe, what feels acceptable. But over time, this creates a kind of inner split, where who you are and how you present yourself begin to drift apart, and that distance can create a quiet discomfort, a sense that something is off, even if everything looks fine on the surface. And that discomfort is not a problem. It is a signal, a sign that something within you is ready to shift, ready to move toward greater alignment, toward a place where you no longer need to constantly manage how you're perceived, where your inner world and your outer expression begin to reconnect. And that process does not happen through more explaining. It happens through something else entirely, through awareness, through honesty, and sometimes through the courage to remain silent when speaking would only take you further away from yourself. There is a quiet strength in that, in choosing not to explain every decision, every feeling, every boundary, not out of resistance, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because you begin to understand that not everything needs to be translated into words. Some things are meant to be lived, to be felt, to be held internally without needing external confirmation. And that understanding changes something fundamental in the way you move through the world. Because you are no longer constantly seeking validation, you are no longer trying to prove your worth through explanation, you are simply standing in it. And yet, this shift is not always easy, because it often comes with consequences. When you stop over-explaining, when you stop justifying yourself, people notice, and not everyone responds well to that change. Some may question you, some may feel uncomfortable, some may even pull away, because they were used to a version of you that was more available, more accommodating, more willing to explain. And when that changes, it disrupts the dynamic. It challenges expectations, and that can feel unsettling, both for them and for you. But this is also where something important becomes clear. The relationships that depend on you constantly explaining yourself are not always the ones that truly support you, because genuine understanding does not require endless justification. It comes from mutual respect, from the ability to hold space for each other without needing constant proof. And when that is missing, no amount of explaining will create it. It can only be recognized or not. So there comes a point where you begin to ask a different question, not how can I explain this better, but do I even need to explain this at all? And that question opens a new direction, one that leads away from constant self-justification and towards something more grounded, more honest, more aligned with who you actually are, not who you think you need to be in order to be accepted. And perhaps the most important realization in all of this is that your existence does not require permission. Your feelings do not need to be approved to be real. Your boundaries do not need to be explained to be valid. And the moment you begin to truly understand that, something shifts, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, in a way that changes how you relate to yourself and to the world around you. Because in that moment, you begin to reclaim something that was always yours. The right to exist without constant explanation, the right to feel without justification, the right to choose yourself without guilt. And that is where healing begins, not in the words you use to explain yourself, but in the silence where you no longer feel the need to. There comes a point, and it does not arrive with noise or announcement, where something inside you quietly settles, not because everything is resolved, not because every question has been answered, but because you are no longer trying to force understanding where it does not exist. And that moment feels different, almost unfamiliar at first, because you're used to filling silence with explanations, used to reaching for words to bridge every gap. But now, you begin to see that not every gap is meant to be closed. Not every silence is meant to be broken. And not every person is meant to fully understand you. In that realization, something deeper begins to unfold. A shift from seeking external clarity to cultivating internal certainty. Because instead of asking how others perceive you, you start asking something more honest, more grounded. What feels true to you? What aligns with your inner sense of direction? What resonates without needing approval? And this shift is subtle, but it changes everything because it moves the center of your life from outside to within, from reaction to intention, from explanation to presence. And presence is something that cannot be explained, it can only be felt. It is the quality of being fully with yourself, without trying to adjust or edit your experience for someone else's comfort. And when you begin to live from that place, your energy changes. Not in a dramatic or performative way, but in a steady, grounded way that others can sense, even if they cannot name it. Because you are no longer seeking permission to exist, you are simply existing. This is where the idea of choosing yourself becomes more than just a phrase. It becomes a lived experience, a daily decision that does not always look impressive from the outside, but carries immense weight internally. Because choosing yourself often means not explaining why you need rest, not explaining why you're stepping back, not explaining why something no longer feels right. It means trusting your internal signals even when they are not fully understood by others. And that kind of trust is something you build slowly through moments where you resist the urge to over-explain and instead allow your choices to stand on their own. Of course, this process is not linear. There will be moments where the old patterns return, where you feel the urge to explain yourself again, to clarify, to justify, to make sure you're being understood. And that is natural, because these patterns were not created overnight. They were shaped over time, through experiences that taught you that being understood was necessary for connection. But now you're learning something new. That connection built on constant self-explanation is fragile, while connection rooted in authenticity, even when it is quiet, even when it is not fully articulated, is something much more stable. And this is where a deeper layer of healing takes place, because you begin to separate your sense of self from the reactions of others. You begin to understand that someone else's inability to understand you does not diminish your truth. It simply reflects their perspective, their limitations, their own internal world, and this understanding creates space where you no longer feel responsible for managing how others perceive you, space where you can exist without constantly adjusting yourself to fit expectations. There is a kind of freedom in that, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like something within you has finally stopped negotiating its own worth. And that freedom does not come from being understood by everyone. It comes from no longer needing to be, because you recognize that your value is not determined by how well you can explain yourself, but by how honestly you can live in alignment with who you are. And yet, one of the most profound shifts happens when you begin to understand the role of your own inner voice in all of this. Because for a long time, that voice may have been shaped by external expectations, by what you were taught was acceptable, by what you believed would keep you safe. But as you step away from constant explanation, you begin to hear something else, something quieter, something more authentic, a voice that does not demand justification, a voice that does not question your right to feel what you feel. And reconnecting with that voice is one of the most important parts of this journey. Because that voice does not ask you to explain yourself, it asks you to listen, to pay attention, to notice what feels true beneath all the layers of conditioning. And when you begin to listen in that way, you start to recognize patterns. The moments where you speak from fear, the moments where you speak from truth. The difference between explaining to be accepted and expressing to be real, and that awareness becomes a guide. Something that helps you navigate your interactions with more clarity, more intention, more honesty. And over time, this awareness transforms the way you relate to silence itself. Because silence is no longer something to fill. It becomes something to inhabit, something to trust, something that allows you to stay connected to yourself even when there are no words. And in that space, you begin to experience a different kind of peace, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment, the sense that you are no longer abandoning yourself in order to maintain connection with others. This is what it means to return to yourself, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality, where your choices, your boundaries, your emotions are no longer things you need to defend, but things you honor quietly, consistently, without the need for constant explanation. And this return is not something that happens once. It is something you practice, something you deepen over time through small decisions, through moments where you choose to remain grounded instead of reactive, silent instead of over-explaining, present instead of performative. And in that practice, something remarkable happens. Your relationships begin to shift, not because you're trying to change them, but because you're no longer participating in the same patterns, the ones built on over-explanation, on seeking validation, on adjusting yourself to be understood. And while some connections may fade as a result of this shift, others will deepen because they are able to meet you where you are without requiring you to constantly justify yourself. And those are the connections that feel different, more stable, more real, because they are not built on explanation, but on presence. At the same time, you may begin to notice something else, a sense of solitude that feels different from loneliness, because it is not about being disconnected from others. It is about being connected to yourself. And that kind of solitude can feel unfamiliar at first, especially if you're used to defining your sense of self through relationships, through interactions, through external validation. But over time, it becomes something grounding, something that allows you to exist without needing constant input from the outside world. And it is in that space that you begin to understand something essential, that your life does not need to be constantly explained in order to be meaningful, that your experiences do not need to be translated into words to be valid, that your emotions do not need to be justified to be real. And this understanding does not make you distant or closed off. It makes you more present, more intentional, more connected to what actually matters. Because you are no longer dispersing your energy trying to make yourself understood by everyone. Instead, you begin to direct that energy inward, toward understanding yourself, toward listening more deeply, toward honoring what you feel without immediately trying to explain it. And this shift changes the way you experience everything, because you're no longer living in reaction to external expectations. You're living in alignment with your internal reality. And that alignment creates a sense of stability that is not easily shaken by misunderstanding or disagreement. And perhaps one of the most powerful aspects of this transformation is that it does not require perfection. It does not require you to always remain silent or to never explain yourself again. It simply asks for awareness, for intention, for the ability to recognize when you are speaking from a place of fear versus when you are speaking from a place of truth. And that distinction alone can change the way you move through your life, because it allows you to choose your words more consciously, to use your voice as a form of expression rather than defense. So the next time you feel the urge to explain yourself, to justify a choice, to clarify a feeling that has not even been questioned, pause for a moment, not to suppress your voice, but to check in with it, to ask yourself where this impulse is coming from. Is it coming from a desire to be understood or from a fear of being misunderstood? And in that pause, you create space where you can choose a different response, one that is aligned with who you are, rather than with what you think is expected of you. Because healing, in its deepest sense, is not about saying more. It is about needing to say less, not because you have nothing to express, but because you no longer feel the need to prove your worth through explanation. And in that shift, something fundamental changes. You stop performing your existence and start living it fully, quietly, without apology. And maybe that is where your real journey begins, not in the words you use to describe yourself, but in the silence where you finally allow yourself to be, without justification, without translation, without fear. So, if something in this message resonated with you, take a moment and reflect on it. And if you feel ready, share in the comments the moment in your life when you realized you no longer needed to explain yourself. And subscribe to the channel for more deep psychological insights that help you reconnect with who you truly are.